My name is John Knoll, and I'm the Chief Creative Officer at Industrial Light and Magic. The Apollo 11 moon landing was the cutting edge of 1960s technology. And today, with the help of my friend and the author of A Man on the Moon, Andy Chaikin.
Good morning.
We're going to recreate the mission with some 21st century technology using the power of Unreal Engine and HoloLens 2. Andrew?
So Apollo 11 landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969, 50 years ago.
I was 7 years old.
I was 13. I've been waiting for this for a long time. And what made it possible was this. The Saturn V moon rocket, the largest rocket ever successfully flown. Each stage had its own part to play, firing for a couple of minutes and then falling away as dead weight.
Yep. You know, for me, one of those iconic images from the Apollo program was the interstage ring falling away from the second stage.
You know, I've always wondered what that was for.
Well, the story is that the second stage, when it comes time for it to fire, it's weightless, and so is the fuel in the tanks. And the drains for the fuel are down at the bottom of the tank. So it needs some kind of thrust for the fuel to flow. So along the base of this skirt, there are 4 solid rocket motors, ullage motors, that fire to provide some of that thrust so the engines can start cleanly.
Okay, and then once the engines can fire, the fuel stays at the bottom.
Exactly. So having done its job, the skirt can be dropped to save that weight.
God, Apollo engineering, so amazing. Well, let's take a look at the entire Apollo 11 space vehicle on Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And we're now going to see Apollo 11 lift off and send Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins on their way to the moon.
So as the rocket ascends and the fuel is spent on the different stages, they're dropped away again to save weight. Stage 2 goes away, and then the only part that leaves Earth orbit is the third stage on the Apollo spacecraft.
And when they do leave Earth orbit, they're traveling at 25,000 miles an hour, which is faster than humans have ever gone, even to this day.
So now during that coast, the command module separates.
Now Mike Collins is at the controls, and he's using the small maneuvering thrusters to turn the spacecraft in a kind of pirouette. And see, there's a docking mechanism in the tip of the command module, and he's going to slowly close in on the lunar module until the docking mechanism engages a receptacle on the top of the lander.
And he pulls the LEM free from the now spent third stage, and there's your Apollo spacecraft.
The last thing that has to happen before they continue is they turn the spacecraft so that the sun is shining on the side. And they start a slow rotation. They actually call it the barbecue mode. And that evens out the sun's intense heat.
So the spacecraft doesn't get cooked on one side.
So the lunar module, it's the ultimate inform meets function engineering.
You know, that's what makes it beautiful for me.
It had to be as lightweight as humanly possible, and so, for example, the walls of the crew cabin in the ascent stage are no thicker than a few sheets of aluminum foil.
So just, no thoughts at all about aerodynamics or any of that.
Well, it didn't have to be aerodynamic because it only flew in the vacuum of space.
It's kind of like a big mechanical insect. So they arrive at the moon. As planned, Neil and Buzz transfer over into the lunar module, and then they begin what amounts to a controlled fall down to the lunar surface. It's the most dangerous part of the whole mission.
And part of it is that they only have enough fuel for one try. So on the way down, they have some pretty tense moments. Computer alarms threaten to abort the landing, but the experts in mission control tell the astronauts they can keep going.
So when Armstrong finally gets a look at where the guidance computer is taking him, he sees that it's to the edge of this gigantic crater. It's about the size of a football stadium. And all along the rim are these big boulders the sizes of cars. And he realizes, I can't land there.
Right, so Armstrong takes over semi-manual control and flies past the crater, hunting for a safe place to land and knowing that his fuel supply is getting lower and lower.
So then as he comes in lower and lower and starts approaching the landing site, the thrust of the engine starts blowing this big sheet of dust. And the motion of that sheet of dust makes it a little bit difficult for Armstrong to evaluate his lateral motion relative to the surface.
And this is very concerning to him because he really wants to come straight down to avoid the risk of breaking off a leg or tipping over.
So you see he wanders around a little bit. In particular, when he touches down, he's actually sliding a little to the left. And that's because that motion of the sheet of dust makes it think he's going to the right.
Finally, they come down those last few feet, and they make the touchdown on the moon so gently that neither Armstrong nor Aldrin actually senses the moment of contact with the moon. Now, 7 hours later, they get into their spacesuits, they depressurize the cabin, they open the front hatch, and Neil Armstrong emerges to climb down the 9 rungs of the ladder on Eagle's front landing leg.
And because of that very gentle landing, the struts didn't have to collapse at all. And so there's less of a space between the bottom rung, or a larger space between the bottom rung and the pad than had originally been planned. So he's got a bigger jump.
But of course, in the moon's 1/6 gravity, it's not really a problem. Now he's down in the footpad and he's being very careful, very methodical. He's describing this powdery surface. And now it's time for that historic first step onto the surface of the moon. And that immortal quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."